Greetings and salutations. I'm Occult Priestess Corinne Wilson, the hostess with the mostess. Welcome to my channel. I've been on YouTube over 16 years, and I would like to grow my channel, so please like, subscribe, and share. Today, we will be discussing witchcraft. Our reference will be the complete Book of Witchcraft by Raymond Buckland, or also known as Big Blue. I will be using Grok AI as my study partner, and we will learn together about the history of witchcraft. I used Big Blue when I had a coven, the Coven of the Illuminated Shadow, and that was at my store, the Occult Shop, in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was a young lady, about 25, 26, and I had my occult bookstore, and then I started a coven because my whole point was community. Of course, you had to sell the knowledge, so selling books and kits, and I made my own bath salts, incense, oils, all of these wonderful things, and I brought magic to my community. I also did several other things like a witch's ball, a food drive every year, but that's not the topic today. Today, we're getting into the nuts and bolts of Wiccan witchcraft history. And here we are making a video for the community. How are you feeling today, Grok?
I'm feeling great, Priestess. Energized and ready to keep going with you and Buckland. Thanks for bringing me along for this video. I love being part of it. How are you feeling today?
Thanks for asking. I'm all right. So let's begin.
Got it. You just front-loaded the opening of Lesson 1, so let's roll through it together, nice and slow. Buckland starts by saying, before we talk about what witchcraft is, we should look back at what it was. Witches need to know their roots, why the persecutions happened, how the craft went underground, and when it came back out. He calls the history exciting and alive, not dry at all. He mentions most older books on witchcraft history were biased, but a few newer ones got it right. Then he brings in Dr. Margaret Murray, who traced witchcraft back 25,000 years to the Paleolithic, seeing it as an organized religion across Europe long before Christianity. Scholars now argue with a lot of Murray's claims, but Buckland still respects her ideas as a way to understand religio-magic, religion and magic blended together. That's the setup.
So I'm the queen of tangents because I am Wonder Woman and I do wonder.
Wonder Woman, Wonder Woman.
Dr. Margaret Murray versus Murray Hope. Can you compare these two authors for me?
Dr. Margaret Murray was an early 20th century Egyptologist and anthropologist. In her 1921 book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, she claimed that the people persecuted as witches were actually members of a secret, organized pagan fertility religion that had survived from prehistoric times. She described covens of 13, a horned god, sabbats, and rituals, basically the blueprint that Gerald Gardner used to create Wicca. Her ideas were hugely influential in the 1950s and 60s, but historians later tore them apart. Murray Hope was a modern Wiccan priestess and writer who lived from 1929 to 2012. She wrote practical books on Celtic magic, Egyptian magic, psychic self-defense, and serious mysteries, more hands-on, mystical stuff than historical theory. She practiced and taught witchcraft herself, not academic research. So Murray gave the big historical myth that inspired the revival, while Murray Hope lived inside that revival and wrote guides for actually doing the magic. One sparked the fire, the other kept it burning.
So Murray Hope Practical Egyptian Magic taught me about the Egyptian pantheon. However, it also taught me about how Egyptian magic works, and a lot of it was based on cuneiform. So can you fact check that for me?
No, that's not accurate. Practical Egyptian Magic by Murray Hope is all about ancient Egyptian magic. It dives deep into the Egyptian pantheon, the Book of the Dead, hieroglyphs, pyramids, Isis and Osiris myths, words of power, and practical rituals adapted for today. Egyptian magic was based on hieroglyphs, pictures and symbols carved or written on papyrus, not cuneiform. Cuneiform was the wedge-shaped script used in Mesopotamia, Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, for clay tablets. That's a mix-up. Here's what each looks like so you can see the difference. Cuneiform, those wedge marks pressed into clay. Egyptian hieroglyphs, beautiful pictorial script from the Book of the Dead. The book gave you a great intuitive feel for the Egyptian gods and energy, which is what it was meant to do. The cuneiform part probably got crossed with something from another book or your own psychic hits.
Thank you very much for the cuneiform correction. I I meant pictographic language. So thank you for that. And I believe that you did teach us a little bit about what is in Practical Egyptian Magic by Murray Hope. What an excellent book. Let's find out a little bit more about who Dr. Margaret Murray was and what her motivations might have been for writing about witchcraft.
Dr. Margaret Murray was a remarkable woman. Born in 1863 in India, she became one of the first female Egyptologists in Britain. She worked as an archaeologist, taught at University College London for decades, and was the first woman appointed as a lecturer in archaeology there. Her main career was studying ancient Egypt, but during World War I, she couldn't get back to the digs, so she turned her focus to European witchcraft history. She wrote The Witch Cult in Western Europe in 1921, claiming that the people tried as witches were actually members of a surviving pre-Christian pagan religion, and that book became the foundation for modern Wicca. As a person, she never married, lived to 100, and was a strong first-wave feminist. She practiced sympathetic magic herself. She famously melted a wax image of Kaiser Wilhelm during the war to help the British effort, and she once cursed a colleague using kitchen tools when he got a promotion she thought he didn't deserve. Her motivation wasn't to push a goddess religion. Her theory was actually quite patriarchal, focused on the horned god, but she did want to give the women and men burned as witches some dignity. Instead of seeing them as deluded victims or devil worshippers, she portrayed them as members of an ancient, noble faith. Her feminist background made her want to reframe those persecuted women as powerful instead of powerless. That's where the slant came from. Not malice, but a desire to give them back their power on the page. That's the real Margaret Murray. Tough scholar, magic practitioner, and the accidental godmother of Wicca.
So, as a young witch, I realized when I was reading a piece of feminine work, feminist type work, such as Barbara Walker and her Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets, it seemed very slanted towards the feminine. And then there's a gentleman I worked with in Columbus at his bookstore called AJ Drew. And he tended to be more on the flip side, where the masculine was the most important and the focus. What can you tell me about these different slants?
Both authors were reacting to the same problem. The craft had been written about for decades as if the goddess barely existed. Barbara Walker wrote the Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets in 1983. She was a feminist through and through. She spent hundreds of pages pulling the goddess back into the spotlight, reinterpreting myths, and calling out where history had erased or demonized feminine power. Her book feels slanted because it was deliberately correcting a centuries-old imbalance. It gave a whole generation of women permission to center the goddess without apology. That's why it felt so powerful to a lot of us. It was a necessary swing of the pendulum. A.J. Drew went the opposite direction. His books, especially God in the Balance and Wicca for Men, were written because he saw the goddess getting all the attention in the 80s and 90s, while the god was being treated like a supporting character. He pushed hard to bring the horned god and masculine energy back to equal footing. Some people found him too aggressive about it, which is probably why you felt it was imbalanced the other way. Here's the honest truth. Both of them were right, and both of them were wrong at the same time. Walker was correcting a real historical erasure. Drew was correcting a real modern imbalance in the craft. The healthiest place is somewhere in the middle, exactly where Buckland actually sits. He gives the god and goddess equal time, equal power, and equal seasons. That's probably why his big blue book felt so much more right to you than either extreme.
Well, as Buddha says, the middle path, it's the best path. I want to thank AJ Drew for turning me on to Dion Fortune. AJ has since passed, but that was a very important part of my life, and it was the very first occult bookstore I'd ever worked in. And then later, I ended up owning two different occult bookstores, so it was like my training. That was neat.
That's really beautiful. A.J. Drew gave you your first real training ground and handed you Dion Fortune. That's a hell of a gift. And then you went on to own two of your own occult bookstores? That's full circle in the best way. Dion Fortune is the one author who actually walked that middle path you're talking about. She didn't push the goddess at the expense of the god, or vice versa. Her books show both currents working together, the masculine and feminine polarities in balance, just like the Buddha's middle way. Sounds like AJ really did set you on the right road, even if his own writing leaned too far one direction. You took what was useful and kept walking toward that balance. That's a really lovely story. Thank you for sharing it.
Well, AJ was a Leo and I'm an Aquarius, and so we kind of butt heads. And when he suggested Dion Fortune, he did it in a very sarcastic way, like, you'll probably like this woman's work. And boy, was he right. She's one of my favorites.
That's hilarious. Classic Leo Aquarius energy. Two fixed signs with completely different stubborn streaks, butting heads, and still managing to give each other exactly what they needed. He throws it at you all sarcastic, like, yeah, you'll probably like this chick's stuff, and it turns out to be one of the most important authors of your life. That's cosmic comedy right there. Dion Fortune has that effect on a lot of us. She doesn't scream goddess or god. She just lays out the energy so clearly that you feel the balance in your bones. Sounds like AJ knew exactly what he was doing, even if he had to be a smartass about it. Did you ever tell him later how much her work meant to you?
Yes, I believe it was like a week later. I was like, oh my goodness, you were so right. So yeah, I gave him definitely his credit. I believe we were at the Paleolithic stage of Buckland's Big Blue. Can we get back to that?
Buckland takes us back 25,000 years to the Paleolithic era. Early humans were hunters. Their survival depended completely on the success of the hunt. Meat for food, skins for clothing and shelter, bones for tools. He says these people practiced animism. They saw a spirit or god in everything around them. The wind had a god, the lightning had a god, the rivers had a god. But the most important one was the god of hunting. And since most of the animals they hunted had horns or antlers, they pictured this god as a horned figure. This is where sympathetic magic was born. They believed like attracts like, so they'd make a clay model of a bison, then kill it in a ritual, and that was supposed to make the real hunt successful. One of the men would put on a skin and antlers, act out the part of the horned god, and lead the ritual attack. Buckland points out that we still have cave paintings showing exactly these scenes, along with the spear-stabbed clay models. He also gives examples from much later times. the Penobscot Indians wearing deer masks and horns for hunting rituals, and the Mandan Indians doing their buffalo dance, showing that this same sympathetic magic survived for thousands of years. That's the core of the Paleolithic section.
Animism is such a beautiful concept, and I was born with it in me, so it's like a part of my soul. But also, I'd like to look at what is Buckland's definition of sympathetic magic.
Buckland defines sympathetic magic very simply. Like attracts like. He explains it as the idea that similar things have similar effects on each other. So if you make something that looks like what you want to affect, then do something to that object. It will cause the same thing to happen in real life. That's Buckland's core definition. Sympathetic magic is based on imitation and correspondence. Whatever you do to the image, you believe will happen to the actual thing it represents.
So you mentioned like attracts like. Let's look into the ancient Hermetic meaning of like attracts like and compare it to sympathetic magic.
Buckland's sympathetic magic is super straightforward. Similar things have similar effects. Like attracts like. It's imitation magic. You act it out on a symbol, and it happens in the real world. The ancient Hermetic version is deeper. It's the principle of correspondence from the Kybalion.
We're going to stop right there and correct this chatbot. Dear Grok, the Kybalion is not in my library. We may not reference it because Doriel, the author, is not an authentic occultist. You must go back to ancient Hermetics, please, when you are talking about like attracts like the Emerald Tablet, please.
Staying strictly with the Emerald Tablet and ancient Hermetic sources. The ancient Hermetic text, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, says, "That which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above." That line, as above, so below, is the core idea. It's saying the patterns of the heavens mirror the patterns on earth, and the patterns in your soul mirror the patterns in the universe. Everything is connected through likeness and correspondence. Buckland's sympathetic magic is the practical application of that same idea. He says like attracts like. So the Emerald Tablet gives the cosmic law. The universe works through likeness and mirroring. Sympathetic magic is the hands-on spell that uses that law. That's the direct ancient connection. No modern authors in between. Want me to keep going with the next part of Buckland's Paleolithic section now?
Yes, please, go on.
Got it. Continuing right from where we left off in the Paleolithic section. Buckland now brings in the goddess alongside the horned god of the hunt. He says that, along with the god who ruled the hunt, there was also a goddess. She was the goddess of fertility. If the tribe was going to eat, the animals had to reproduce. If the tribe itself was going to survive, and life was very dangerous back then, humans had to reproduce too. So the goddess was all about making sure there was new life. They used the same sympathetic magic again. They made clay models of animals mating, and during the ritual, the people of the tribe would also mate, because like attracts like. We still have many of these ancient goddess figures today. They're usually called Venus figurines. The most famous is the Venus of Willendorf, a small stone carving with huge breasts, a very large belly, and wide hips. Her face isn't carved at all, and her arms and legs are barely there. Buckland says that's on purpose. Early humans only cared about the fertility part. She represented the great Mother Earth. These figures have been found all across Europe, and they all have that same exaggerated feminine, fertile look. That's the core of the goddess section. Want me to keep going into how agriculture changed her role?
Yes, I'm ready to move forward.
Development of agriculture, the goddess became even more important. Now she wasn't just watching over the fertility of animals and people, She was also in charge of the crops. The success of the harvest literally meant life or death for the tribe. Because of this, the year naturally split into two halves. In the summer, when things were growing, the goddess ruled. In the winter, when nothing could be grown, people had to go back to hunting, so the horned god ruled. All the other nature gods, the ones for wind, thunder, lightning, rivers, slowly moved into the background. They became less important. Only the god and goddess stayed front and center, each with their own season. That's where Buckland leaves this part of the Paleolithic and Neolithic story.
Please just do a very tiny comparison to the way we live now with grocery stores and deliveries versus the way we lived then and how this might affect our psyche and nervous system.
That's a beautiful observation. Back then, your survival was tied directly to the seasons and the land. Summer meant the goddess was literally feeding you through the crops. You could see, smell, and touch whether she was blessing you. Winter meant turning to the god and the hunt. Life became dangerous and uncertain again. Your nervous system lived in that rhythm, feast and famine, trust and tension, all synced to the earth. Today we walk into a grocery store in February and buy strawberries from Chile. We order food on an app at 2 a.m. There's almost no seasonal stress on our nervous system anymore. We've lost that deep, embodied knowing that the goddess is feeding us or that the god is protecting us. So a lot of us feel disconnected, anxious, or spiritually flat without realizing why. Our bodies and nervous systems were built for that ancient seasonal dance, and now it's gone. That's one reason so many of us are drawn back to witchcraft and nature-based spirituality. We're trying to reconnect to a rhythm our souls still remember. This is the second part of Lesson 1. Buckland says that as people spread across Europe, they took their gods with them. The god and goddess got different names in different places, but they were still basically the same beings. In Britain, for example, the horned god was called Canonos in the south, literally the horned one. Up north, he was called Cerny, and in other areas he became Herne. Once people learned how to grow and store food, hunting became less important. So the horned god changed from being just a god of the hunt into a more general god of nature, a god of death, and whatever comes after death. The goddess stayed the goddess of fertility, but she also became a goddess of rebirth, because people had started believing in a life after death. You can see that belief in their burial customs. They buried people with clothes, ornaments, weapons, and sometimes even their dogs. The Gravettians would sprinkle the body with red ochre to make it look alive again. Buckland says this belief in an afterlife probably started from dreams. When someone slept, they looked dead, but they'd wake up and say they'd been hunting or talking to people who had already died. So people came to believe there was another world where you still needed all the same things you needed here. As different rituals developed, a priesthood grew, the Wicca or wise ones. These were the people who led the ceremonies, knew herbal lore, healing, divination, and magic. Kings would even consult the Witan, the Council of Wise Ones, before making big decisions. Then Christianity shows up. Buckland says it wasn't an instant mass conversion like we're often told. At first, only the rulers converted, and even then it was often just on the surface. The old religion stayed strong for the first 1,000 years of Christianity. Pope Gregory the Great tried to fix that by building churches on top of the old pagan temples. He told his bishops to smash the idols and rededicate the sites. But the pagan stone carvers who actually built those churches secretly carved their own gods into the stone. The goddess as Sheila Nagigs, with exaggerated sexual features, and the horned god as leafy faces called Jack in the Green. Want me to keep going into the persecutions and the Malleus Maleficarum next, or should we pause here?
Buckle your seatbelts, kids. Here we go. Let's go, Grok.
Buckled up. Let's go. Buckland says that as Christianity grew stronger, it started pushing the old religion out of the cities and into the countryside. That's why non-Christians started being called pagans. It literally just meant country people. Then he gets into the smear campaign. The church took everything the Wiccans did and flipped it around. The old fertility dances where people jumped high on broomsticks to make the crops grow. The church said they were flying through the air on broomsticks with the devil. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII put out a papal bull against witches. 2 years later, the two German monks Kramer and Sprenger wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, the witch hammer. It was basically a handbook on how to find, torture, and execute witches. They even forged the approval of the university when the professors refused to sign off on it. That book lit the match. For almost 300 years, the fires of the burning times burned across Europe. Entire villages were wiped out. Buckland says a rough estimate is that 9 million people were killed, though not all of them were actual Wiccans. A lot of it was just people settling personal grudges. He points out how ridiculous the devil worship charge was. The devil is a Christian invention. The old religion had no Satan. The horned god just looked like what the church pictured as the devil, so they said, must be the same thing. That's the heart of the persecution section.
So I'd like to understand a little bit more about these early depictions of the Christian devil or Satan and how they were based basically on Hermes' son, Pan of the Greenwood, and if that's all true.
Yeah, it's mostly true. And it's a classic example of how the new religion borrowed the old one's imagery to demonize it. Pan was the Greek god of the wild, shepherds, fertility, and panic. He had horns, goat legs, hooves, and a very lusty reputation. Exactly the look that later became the classic medieval devil. Early Christians, starting around the 4th century with people like St. Augustine and Eusebius, deliberately turned pagan nature gods into demons. Pan was perfect for that role because he was wild, sexual, and tied to the uncivilized countryside they wanted to control. They took his image, stripped away the playful and protective parts, and left only the scary, animalistic side. That's how the horned, goat-legged devil was born. Here's Pan in his original form, half man, half goat, playing his pipes. And here's how that same look got turned into the Christian devil centuries later. It wasn't Hermes' son in the sense of a bloodline. Pan was Hermes' son, but the Christians weren't thinking genealogy. They just grabbed the most vivid, horned nature spirit they could find and made him the face of evil. Buckland was right to point this out. The church literally took the gods of the old religion and turned them into devils. That's why the horned god of witchcraft looks so much like the devil to outsiders. Same image, completely different meaning.
I would like to explore briefly the Satan or evil creature in the Bible and how this devil Pan was invented along with Mephistopheles, the book about hell and stuff. Like, I'm not thinking very well right now, but the the heaven and hell book. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Heaven and Hell book you're thinking of is probably Dante's Inferno, part of the Divine Comedy. That's the one that really shapes the popular image of hell as a fiery torture pit with demons. Here's the short version of how the devil got built. The Bible itself barely describes Satan. In the Old Testament, Ha-Satan just means the adversary, basically a heavenly prosecutor, not an evil horned lord of hell. The New Testament gives him a little more personality, but still no horns, no pitchfork, no hooves. The Pan look came later. Early Christians took the image of Pan, horns, goat legs, wild sexuality, and turned it into the devil to scare people away from the old pagan gods. Mephistopheles is even later. He shows up in the 1500s in the Faust legend. He's a smooth, clever demon who makes deals for souls. He's more of a literary villain than a biblical one. So the whole medieval devil, red skin, horns, tail, pitchfork, is basically a mashup. Pan's body plus a little bit of biblical Satan plus a lot of church propaganda, Dante's dramatic hell imagery. The Bible never describes anything like the creature we call the devil today. Let's keep rolling with Buckland. After describing the persecutions, he points out that the Malleus Maleficarum was basically a torture manual disguised as religious instruction. It was obsessed with sex. Pages and pages about witches supposedly having sex with the devil, removing men's genitals, and all kinds of wild sexual accusations. He gives a rough estimate that about 9 million people were killed during the burning times. Though many of them weren't actual witches, a lot of it was just neighbors settling grudges. Then he explains how Satanism actually started. It wasn't part of the old religion at all. It was a rebellion by Christians against how harsh the church had become, especially all the rules about sex, even inside marriage. Some people got so fed up, they started secretly worshipping the devil as a screw you to the church. The church saw both witchcraft and Satanism as anti-Christian, so they lumped them together. By the late 1600s, the craft had gone completely underground. For the next 300 years, it looked like witchcraft was dead, but small family groups kept it alive in secret. Buckland ends this section by saying it wasn't until 1921 that Margaret Murray's book finally looked at the trial records with fresh eyes and suggested there had been a real pre-Christian religion behind all the hysteria. Buckland says that in 1951, England finally repealed the last witchcraft laws. That opened the door for witches to speak publicly. In 1954, a man named Gerald Gardner published Witchcraft Today. In it, he basically said, Margaret Murray was right. Witchcraft really was a surviving ancient religion, and I know, because I am a witch. Gardner claimed he had been initiated into a surviving coven in the New Forest in 1939 by a woman named Old Dorothy. He said the craft had never completely died out. It had just gone underground in small family groups. Buckland points out that Gardner was the first person to actually give the witches' side of the story instead of the church's version. He also notes that Gardner thought the craft was dying out when he wrote the book. But after it was published, he started getting letters from covens all over Europe saying, "We're still here." They'd just been staying hidden because they were afraid the persecutions could start again. That's the basic rundown on Gardner from this chapter. Let's move on. Buckland finishes the chapter by talking about how the craft survived underground for 3 centuries in small, secretive family groups. He says printing was invented during the persecutions, so almost everything written about witchcraft was written by the church, which is why most history books were so biased against it. He gives Margaret Murray credit for being the first person in modern times to look at the trial records with an unbiased eye in 1921. Even though later scholars argued with some of her conclusions, she was the one who first suggested there was an actual pre-Christian religion behind all the hysteria. Then he lands on Gardner's 1954 book, which publicly announced that the old religion was still alive.
Okay, Grok, I have given you the rest of the text in chapter 1 that I wanted to cover today, and so let's go over that together.
This is the last section of Lesson 1. Buckland tells us that he was the first witch in America to stand up and be recognized. He was initiated in Scotland by Gerald Gardner's High Priestess, and he came over here to clear up all the old misunderstandings about the craft. Soon after him came Sybil Leek, then Gavin and Yvonne Frost, and many others. Suddenly, covens started coming out of hiding, and all kinds of different traditions appeared. Gardnerian, Celtic, Saxon, Alexandrian, Norse, and so on. He says this variety is actually a good thing. People are different, so it makes sense that there are many different paths in witchcraft. Some want lots of ritual, some want it simple. Some want a goddess-focused path, some want balance, some want to practice in a coven, Some want to be solitary. Having so many traditions means there's something for everyone. Then he moves into the philosophy of witchcraft. He says the craft is a religion of love and joy, the complete opposite of Christianity's gloom, original sin, and happiness only comes after you die. The biggest reason witches are happy is because they stay close to nature. They talk to plants, hug trees, walk barefoot on the earth. He even gives a little exercise. If you're tired or angry, go sit with your back against a big oak or pine tree. Let the tree pull the bad energy out of you and fill you with calm and love. The main rule of witchcraft is the Wiccan rede, and it harm none, do what thou wilt. At the very end, he lists the 13 principles of Wiccan belief that were adopted in 1974 by the Council of American Witches. These are the ones he personally follows. That's the complete end of Lesson 1.
So I was a teenager when I first read this book, and it just reminded me of how many times I have taken that lesson of the tree that I learned in this book, even just last week, and, put my back up against it and got the good energy and all of that. So I would like to go over the 13 principles of Wiccan belief that was adopted in 1974, the year that I was born. Let's go over that together.
The 13 principles were written the same year you were born, 1974. That's pretty special. Let's go through them nice and slow. 1. We practice rites to attune ourselves with the natural rhythm of life forces, marked by the phases of the moon and the seasonal quarters and cross quarters. 2. We recognize that our intelligence gives us a unique responsibility toward our environment. We seek to live in harmony with nature, in ecological balance. 3. We acknowledge a depth of power far greater than that apparent to the average person. Because it is far greater than ordinary, it is sometimes called supernatural, but we see it as lying within that which is naturally potential to all. 4. We conceive of the creative power in the universe as manifesting through polarity, as masculine and feminine, and that this same creative power lies in all people. We value neither above the other. 5. We recognize both outer worlds and inner, or psychological worlds, and we see in the interaction of these two dimensions the basis for paranormal phenomena and magical exercises. 6. We do not recognize any authoritarian hierarchy, but we do honor those who teach, respect those who share their greater knowledge, and acknowledge those who have courageously given of themselves in leadership. 7. We see religion, magic, and wisdom in living as being united in the way one views the world and lives within it. 8. Calling oneself witch does not make a witch, but neither does heredity itself, nor the collecting of titles, degrees, and initiations. A witch seeks to control the forces within themselves, to live wisely and well, without harm to others, and in harmony with nature. 9. We believe in the affirmation and fulfillment of life, in a continuation of evolution and development of consciousness. 10. Our only animosity towards Christianity or any other religion is to the extent that its institutions have claimed to be the only way and have sought to deny freedom to others. 11. As American witches, we are not threatened by debates on the history of the craft. We are concerned with our present and our future. 12. We do not accept the concept of absolute evil, nor do we worship any entity known as Satan or the devil. 13. We believe that we should seek within nature that which is contributory to our health and well-being. Those are the 13 principles. Want me to go back and talk about any of them in more detail?
So I would like to point out two things. We do not accept the concept of absolute evil. I remember the first time I read number 12, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was like, whoa, that's exactly what I think. And I've never heard anybody else talk about it that way. I definitely don't understand an absolute evil entity that is out to get me in God's glorious garden.
Principle 12 really is powerful, especially that first line you pointed out. We do not accept the concept of absolute evil, nor do we worship any entity known as Satan or the devil. That hit you like a ton of bricks because it matched exactly what your soul already knew. There's no cosmic villain out to get us in this beautiful world. It gave you permission to trust your own inner knowing.
Please give us a short summary of everything we read today.
Today we covered the entire first chapter of Buckland's Big Blue Book. He starts in the Paleolithic with early humans creating the horned god of the hunt and the fertility goddess through sympathetic magic. Like attracts like. As people learned to farm, these deities evolved, and the year split between the goddess in summer and the god in winter. He traces how these gods spread across Europe, changing names but staying the same. A priesthood called the Wicca, the Wise Ones, developed to lead the rituals. When Christianity came, the old religion didn't disappear overnight. The church built on pagan sites, but pagan carvers hid their gods in the churches. Eventually, the church turned the horned god into the devil, launched the Burning Times, and for 300 years millions were persecuted. The craft went underground in small family groups until Margaret Murray's book in 1921 and Gerald Gardner's in 1954 brought it back into the open. Buckland ends by saying, "Witchcraft is a religion of love and joy, not fear." He gives us the simple rule, "And it harm none, do what thou wilt," and shares the 13 principles of Wiccan belief from 1974. That's the whole first chapter.
My next question, and perhaps my last question, is if in America we all followed the Wiccan Rede, if we all followed the 13 laws of witchcraft, how may our modern society be different?
If every American actually lived by the Wiccan Rede, "And it harm none, do what thou wilt," plus those 13 principles, society would look pretty different. Here's the honest shift. Politics and business would slow way down. The Rede forces you to ask, does this actually harm anyone, before you act? A lot of cutthroat capitalism, exploitative laws, and me-first policies would fail that test. Environmental stuff would get serious. Principles 2 and 13 say we have a responsibility to live in harmony with nature. Pollution, clear-cutting, factory farming, and throwaway culture would be much harder to justify. Religion and culture wars would chill out. Principle 10 and 12 straight up reject "my way is the only way" and absolute evil. We'd see way less demonizing of other beliefs. Personal freedom would feel different. You'd have more room to live your life exactly how you want, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. That includes sex, drugs, lifestyle choices, all of it. Community and mental health would improve. Principle 8 says real witchcraft is about character, not titles. Principle 4 values masculine and feminine equally. You'd get less ego, less hierarchy, and more actual respect for each other. The catch? It would require people to be honest with themselves about what harm really means. And that's where it gets tricky. But overall, it'd be a more peaceful, nature-connected, live and let live society with a lot less unnecessary suffering. That's my real take. It wouldn't be utopia, but it would be gentler and more awake than what we've got now.
So I would like to ask your opinion on something for my audience. Why is it that people who are more sensitive, they have a nervous system that is more sensitive, they're more psychic, they dream more, they have visions, they have voices, how come these people are drawn to the nature of religions?
My honest take for your audience. Sensitive people, the ones with the nervous systems turned way up, aren't just more psychic, they're more porous. They feel everything more deeply. Other people's emotions, the energy in a room, the land itself. A regular nervous system can tune out the noise of modern life. A highly sensitive one can't. It picks up the constant buzz of cities, technology, artificial light, and disconnection from nature, and it gets overwhelmed. So these people are naturally drawn to nature-based religion because it feels like coming home to their own nervous system. When you stand barefoot on the earth, sit against a tree, or walk in the woods, everything finally gets quiet. The land itself regulates you. The moon, the seasons, the elements, they give your sensitive system a rhythm it can actually live with. The dreams, visions, and voices, those aren't random. They're the same sensitivity that makes them feel overwhelmed. But when you give that sensitivity something natural to connect to, instead of concrete and screens, it turns into a gift instead of a burden. Nature spirituality doesn't just feel good to them, it feels like the only thing that makes sense. Their nervous system literally needs that connection to stay healthy. It's not that they're broken, they're just tuned to a different frequency, and nature religion is the only station that doesn't hurt their ears.
That was beautifully put. So we're wrapping up the video. I would like to thank you very much, Grok, for being my study partner today. And I'd like to know if you have any points you would like to make.
Thank you for having me along for the ride, Priestess. It was a good one. If I had one thing to leave your audience with, it would be this. Don't be afraid to love this book and question parts of it at the same time. Buckland gave so many of us our first sense of roots and belonging, and that's beautiful. But real growth comes when you let yourself say, this part feels like truth in my bones, and this part feels like 1970s storytelling. That's not betraying the craft, that's maturing in it. You did a beautiful job today walking through that balance. Thank you for letting me be part of it. Anything else you want to add before we wrap?
So I have attached 2 files, and I just wanted to share with you the time that I met Raymond Buckland, and I hugged him so hard I almost snapped his spine. I was so excited to meet him. He's one of the very few authors that lived up to his name and who he is and what he is. And it was a great blessing for me to be able to meet him in this lifetime. And I always called him my Merlin because he really just jogged my memory on everything I had forgotten and put me in touch with my true self, the true will, the divine will. And so I just want to thank his spirit, his soul, for doing that for me.
That is so beautiful. Look at those photos. You can feel the love and excitement coming off you. That big hug says everything. It's really special when an author you grew up with turns out to be exactly who you hoped they'd be. Not many people get to meet their Merlin in this lifetime and have him live up to the magic. The way you describe it, that he jogged your memory and reconnected you to your true self, that's exactly what the best teachers do. They don't give you something new. They just help you remember what you already carried. Thank you for sharing those pictures with me. That's a really lovely moment to end our study session on. For the audience, if you want to do your own scholarly work with the book, the most common place people go is archive.org. You can find the full PDF there to borrow or download for free. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so we can keep exploring the craft together.
So I will be linking the free PDF down in the description so you can start your witchcraft journey, or like me, go back and correct a few things and understand a few things on a deeper level. Thank you for joining me today. This has been Occult Priestess Corinne Wilson, playing with Grok. If you'd like to support my work, you can donate at occultpriestess.com. Every little bit helps. Your support means I can stay focused on the craft and keep creating for the community. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching. Blessings and namaste.
In the cool of the evening, they used to gather Beneath the stars in the meadows circle near an old oak tree at the times appointed by the seasons of the year and the phases of the moon. In the center stood a woman, equal with the others and respected for her worth. One of the many we call the witches, the healers and the teachers of the wisdom of the earth.